Thank you, Galili, for the introduction, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm going to talk about Jean Améry. This is a small, very small part of a book that that's coming out in the next few months, I hope. And the book is an attempt to reintroduce Améry not only as a Holocaust survivor, but also as a philosopher. And the book has three thematic axes: identity, time, and failure. And what I'm going to present to you today belongs to identity. It's the first part, and has to do, as we'll see in a minute, a lot with home, being at home, and mainly with not being at home. So a few questions preoccupied Jean Améry more persistently than that of identity. Again and again, his writings return to the fissures of the self, to the dissonances that refuse reconciliation. For Améry, identity is never seamless or whole. It is marked by fracture, contradiction, and estrangement from oneself. These convictions runs through his reflections on aging, exile, torture, and other experiences in which the self appears not as a unity, but as a split existence, at once a self and an other. The question of identity is always for him a question of belonging to language, to a culture, a religion, history, and finally to a place. But belonging is never stable and always ridden with conflict. Identity emerges as emblematic of the divided nature of selfhood itself, caught between affirmation and doubt, necessity and impossibility. Yet importantly, these paradoxes are never abstract for Améry. They were inscribed in his own life. This finds one of its most personal expressions in his decision to change his name from Hans Meyer to Jean Améry in 1955, a decade after the war. The act marked a deliberate severing of ties with Austrian and German culture, a distancing from the unmistakably German resonance of his birth name. Yet the choice of the French-sounding Améry, a scrambled version of Meyer, using the same 5 letters, resonates with the French amer, or bitterness, a word that intensifies the gesture by binding reinvention with resentment, and resentment is one of Améry's most famous essays. The name enacts and undoes rupture at once. It gestures towards a new beginning, while carrying the past within its very letters. Identity, he suggests, cannot be discarded at will. It is constituted by the very contradictions one might wish to escape. Even in an act of rebellion, traces of the old self remain, unerasable, essential. If the name change was intended as a new beginning, then only its failure allows its truth to appear. That he is at once who he had always been, an Austrian-born Jew, a Holocaust survivor, and someone newly fashioned, a cosmopolitan thinker stepping out under a new name. In the essay, How Much Homeland Does a Person Need, from 1965-66, written before adopting his new name, Améry reflects on the dislocation of exile. Though he had fled the geographical space associated with his Austrian past, he could not escape its linguistic and cultural resonance, how others addressed him, or the sounds that continued to echo within him. Everything that had once shaped his consciousness, his homeland's history, language, and landscapes, had become unbearable for him. Exile became existential. It was no longer anchored in any community. It was deprived of self-possession, and he became, in his own eyes, as he testifies, a stranger to himself. He illustrates the ambiguity of identity through an incident from 1943. While preparing resistance propaganda, He and his comrades were interrupted by a German soldier from the neighboring apartment, an SS officer who was irritated simply by the noise and was unaware of who they were. The true shock for Améry was not the danger of this SS soldier, but rather the man's voice, the dialect of his own native region, a sound he had not heard in years. Fear was pierced by an involuntary intimacy, and for an instant, the enemy appeared as a potential friend, as Améry describes it. And he even imagined addressing him in our language and sharing a moment on a glass of wine. The scene crystallizes a painful recognition. However familiar its echoes, his homeland would always remain his enemy. 12 years later, he changes his name. Yet, despite this radical gesture, he found no new we to belong to and no revitalized I to inhabit. His intellectual world remained thoroughly German, the language in which he felt most intimately at home, underscoring a bond that could not be severed. But this inability to fully escape his past does not, I want to argue, render the renaming meaningless. It reveals that identity is shaped not simply by pure rupture, but by a very intricate and interesting negotiation of continuity. His new name can be seen as an expression of the complex interplay between the multiple and unavoidable layers of the self. A name does not confer a stable self. It offers, at most, an illusion of stability. That he retained the same letters in moving from Maya to Améry gestures towards continuity within the change, or the persistence of what cannot or can never be shed. A similar tension runs even deeper in Améry's reflection on his Jewish identity. If the renaming exposed the fissure between the German past and his new chosen self, Jewishness revealed a more fundamental paradox, an identity that was at once imposed, existentially unavoidable, and yet impossible to inhabit. This emerges with particular force in the necessity and impossibility of being a Jew, where Améry confronts the paradoxes internal to Jewish identity. Here, identity is never singular. It is always liminal, precariously suspended between self-affirmation and self-doubt. His analysis challenges externally imposed labels while affirming the dual structure of identity as something that is at once necessary and impossible. He is at once familiar to himself and radically foreign, a condition that, in his description, borders on the tragic. This tension is captured in this simultaneity of necessity and impossibility, or Zwang und Unmöglichkeit, that gives the essay its title. And I quote briefly from the essay. If today discomfort arises in me when a Jew takes it for granted, legitimately, that I am part of his community, then it is not because I don't want to be a Jew, but only because I cannot be one. And yet I must be one. The necessity and impossibility of being a Jew. This is what causes me this indistinct pain, end quote. Améry's account breaks with the conventional views that we usually have of identity as an inner core or a secure ground for self-recognition. He neither fully identifies with nor rejects his Jewishness. He's suspended between the necessity and the impossibility, between being identical and estranged from himself. Améry's self-characterization is stark. I quote again, I am precisely what I am not, because I did not exist until I became it, above all else, a Jew, end quote. True self-definition, he suggests, depends on recognizing that there is no stable self. The only self that exists is the simultaneity with a non-self. This is something I'll just say in brackets then that in other contexts, specifically his discussion of old age, he discusses under the term I, not I, or the ich, nicht ich. Negation for Améry is not an external renunciation, but an inner fracture, without which no self can emerge. Identity unfolds, therefore, in a suspended space, neither wholly defined by what it is, nor reducible to what it is not. This suspension becomes, paradoxically, in Améry, a site of agency. The non-self is not simply a void, but an integral component of identity itself. What is negated gains ontological weight, equal to what is affirmed. Identity becomes a process rather than a possession, marked by fragmentation, by flux and incompleteness. It is illuminating in this context to return to the essay on the homeland, where identity is framed through the terms of homelessness and exile. Here, Améry explores the deep link between spatial displacement and existential dislocation. Early in the essay, he draws a powerful parallel between homesickness and self-alienation. I quote, our homesickness was alienation from the self. Suddenly the past was buried and one no longer knew who one was, end quote. Exile is therefore not only spatial, not only a movement from a place or a language, but also it is temporal. It severs the bond with the past and erodes the continuity or the alleged continuity of the self. To be securely rooted in a world means for Améry to be attached to a place, to language, and to a shared history. Exilic existence dismantles these ties, stripping the world of order and leaving one unable to act freely or spontaneously. His decision to adopt a French-sounding name was an attempt to sever himself from the past, to bury the German identity or the German ties to persecution and to displacement. Yet, even this gesture exposed the impossibility, the essential impossibility of reinventing himself. He writes, I was a person who could no longer say we, and who therefore said I, merely out of habit, but not with a feeling of a full possession of myself. There was no longer an I, and did not live within a we. Alienation here is compounded by the pain of homesickness, which for Améry extends beyond, again, the physical place. It is a form of what he calls Selbstzerstörung, or something like self-destruction. He writes, whoever has lost his homeland remains lost himself. And yet the pain he describes surpasses that of a mere loss. Exile can be devastating, but it can also offer a kind of anchor, if, and only if, there is a homeland to which one might someday, even potentially, return to. Améry realizes, however, that what he had once considered the homeland, the language, the imagined belonging, was always an illusion. Belgium, his adopted home, likewise remained opaque and foreign. He is not simply exiled from a place, but in a deeper state of an existential homelessness. There is nowhere in the world, not Austria, and not Germany, and not Belgium, where he feels at home. And this idea of existentially and essentially never feeling at home is also almost an exact quote of what he says about himself when he describes the experiences of torture that he had undergone during the war. And he says that he can never be at home in the world. Strikingly, it is in this same essay about the homeland that Améry draws a subtle but powerful analogy between exile and the process of aging. Both, he suggests, are shaped by a constriction of the future and a growing dependence on the past. The exile and the aging subject alike must reckon with a sense of self that can no longer project itself into a horizon of future possibilities, but is instead anchored in memory. In contrast to the young person, whose identity is open to becoming, I quote, he is not only who he is, but also who he will be. The aged person is confined to the present. I quote again, he is only who he is. Aging, like exile, intensifies the role of memory in sustaining identity. The past becomes not simply a reservoir of recollection, but the only vital ground of selfhood. The fractures of identity that his book on aging exposes, or this reference to aging, through the experience of time and the aging body, reappear here in the context of exile. And near the end of this essay on the homeland, he recounts a case that weaves together perhaps some of the themes that he explored and that I presented here. The loss of the homeland and of language and culture, the question of identity and its relation to memory, and ultimately old age. So while interred for a few months in the Gour camp in France, Améry encountered Alfred Montbert, an aging German poet from Karlsruhe. Montbert, nearly 70 years old and once a very acclaimed poet, was shattered by what had befallen him during the war. And in a letter he writes, and Améry quotes, he says, I quote, "Everything flows off me like a great rain. Everything had to remain behind. Has anything similar ever happened to a German poet?" This is Montbert's letter. Améry quotes these lines and finds them almost unbearable, as he writes. Montbert's identity has been irrevocably altered by deportation and the erasure of his cultural legacy. His past life as a celebrated poet was washed away like rain. The metaphor captures a near total liquidation of identity, sharpened by his continued use of German, which linked him to a past that now estranged him, continued writing in German. Montbert's plight exemplifies the cruel paradox of exile, the past which once grounded identity becomes a source of pain when denied recognition. Montbert died 1 year later in Switzerland. His past erased, his legacy lost, and his future foreclosed. Once his former readers had undone his verse, this is how Améry describes it, he was no longer in his own eyes a German poet. Améry concludes this account with a return to the theme of aging and writes that everything flowed off like a great rain was experienced more profoundly by those who survived the Third Reich and had the time to come to terms with themselves. At the latest, they understood it on the day when, for the first time, they felt themselves aging. So there's a lot to say about this connection to old age and to the end of life, maybe in the questions phase. Améry's identity is, in fact, a counter-identity. It is assembled out of rupture, of exile, and refusal. The question of identity is revealed to be fundamentally unstable, not a possession, but a site of tension. His reflections on the impossibility of fully inhabiting the self, of being wholly Jewish, wholly German, wholly oneself, do not point towards mere resignation, but towards a different kind of what I want to call the fidelity, fidelity to the very structure of fracture. His identity emerges less from origins and community than from articulating experiences within the fractures of his identity, without any pretense of mending these fractures. In this sense, the identity he claims is not grounded in resolving contradictions, but in lucidly inhabiting them. And it is precisely through this fidelity to the broken that his voice continues to resist erasure. And Améry's identity was always fractured. I didn't recount his life story. Probably most of you know it. He was a survivor, he was a rebel, a Jew for whom Jewishness was both imposed and unbearable, a man bound by history yet compelled towards autonomy, which he wrote about towards his involuntary death. This is how he ended his life. These were not contradictions to be resolved, but tensions to be endured, to be observed, philosophically observed, existential fault lines that both wounded and sustained him. In death as in life, the fracture remained. In the 2 suicide notes that he left for the police and the hotel staff, where he took his pills, he signed not with 1 name, but with 2. Hans Meyer, the name of birth, ancestry, and the world he never truly belonged to, and Jean Améry, the name he forged for himself. But the order matters. Meyer came first, as if to acknowledge that in the final reckoning, he could not escape the claim of origins, or perhaps he wished to grant it a belated recognition. This internal split was inscribed again on his grave in Vienna, which I visited last year, where both names appear side by side on the gravestone, along with a number that was tattooed on his arm in Auschwitz, 17234. In these last traces, we glimpse the core of Améry's philosophical predicament, not the reconciliation of conflicting identities, but their enduring coexistence without synthesis. He died as both, and perhaps in the deepest sense, as the very dissonance he thought to overcome. Thank you.